It was 11:20 at night when I had just finished up my shift at work. Since my car was still in the shop, I had no choice but to walk home. I figured it wouldn't be that big of a deal because my job was only about 5 minutes away on foot. Plus, if I cut through Oakwood Park behind my house, the trip would be even shorter. I left the store and started walking home, surprised at how peaceful everything felt. In what seemed like no time, I reached the park near my neighborhood. With my phone flashlight on, I didn't feel uneasy at all, at least not until I actually stepped into the park. As soon as I passed the swing set, I noticed someone sitting on a bench near the public restrooms. I was already a little on edge, simply because it was late at night, and now I had to walk right past a stranger. My unease only grew when they suddenly called out to me. I flinched slightly, trying to play it off, but the stranger noticed and immediately spoke again.
"My bad, man, didn't mean to scare you. I was just hoping you might have a cigarette."
I exhaled, trying to calm myself down, and told him honestly that I didn't smoke. I apologized and figured that would be the end of the conversation. I turned to leave, telling him to have a good night, but apparently that wasn't what he had in mind. I heard him scoff under his breath, and then in a low voice he muttered, "The hell." There was movement behind me. He wasn't sitting anymore. As much as I hoped he was just walking the other way, I could tell. He was following me. "Hey, wait up. Where do you think you're going?" he called out. I picked up my pace. By that point, I could already see my house across the street on the other side of the park. The sound of his footsteps behind me quickened, and I knew he was getting closer. Then he shouted again, "You've got to have something for me, kid." That's when fear fully took over. I ran. The only thing between me and my house was a small stretch of open field at the end of the park, then a gated fence I'd have to hop over before crossing the street. Every step I took, I swore I could hear him taking one right behind me. I didn't dare look back. I knew if I slowed down even for a second, he'd catch me. I reached my house, slammed the door shut, and locked it behind me. My mom wasn't home yet. She was working late, so I was completely alone. My mind raced. I had no idea if the man was still out there or what I should do next. After a few moments of deep breaths, I cautiously walked over to the window and peeked through the curtain. My stomach dropped. He was standing in my driveway, staring directly at my front door. I stepped back, shaking. I didn't know what else to do, so I grabbed my phone and called the police. I told them a man had chased me from the park and was now standing outside my house. They arrived as fast as they could, but just as they turned onto my street, the man must have seen them, because he took off running back through the park. As far as I know, they never caught him. My mom got home a few minutes after the police left. We explained everything to her, and she insisted we change the locks on all the doors and windows, just to be safe. That was the last time I ever walked home alone at night. Thankfully, my car was ready for pickup the next day. This is a strange thing that happened to me not too long ago. I was out for a walk one night, trying to get my steps in. I have a fitness tracker, and I aim to walk at least 9,000 steps per day. Some days I hit that goal early, depending on what I'm doing. Other days, I find myself walking at night just to make up for it. This story takes place on one of those nights. It was around 9 p.m., and I still had only about 5,000 steps logged. The weather was really nice, so I decided to go for a walk outside to make up the difference. At first, I was hesitant about walking that late, but eventually I thought, why not? And went for it. My house is in a typical suburban neighborhood in Ohio. It's a quiet area with lots of houses, wide streets, and no sidewalks. It's a pretty large neighborhood overall, with streets that interconnect like a maze. I left my house, walked down the driveway, and started walking along my street. It was peaceful and quiet, exactly what you'd expect at this hour. I walked to the end of my street and turned onto the next one over. I didn't have a set route in mind. I just planned to wander around the nearby streets until I got to 8,000 steps, then head back home. By the time I reached my front door, I'd be close to 10,000 steps, or right on target. As I walked down the next street, I noticed a car turn onto it from the main road. At first I didn't think much of it, but then I realized it was moving unusually slow, less than 10 miles per hour. That raised a bit of concern, but I tried to brush it off. The car was heading toward me, and since there were no sidewalks, I moved to the side of the street to let it pass. The car crept by me, but I didn't glance over to see who was driving. I figured it was just someone being cautious. After it passed, the car turned onto another street, and I kept walking. Eventually, I reached the end of my street and turned down the next one over. I was nearing my 8,000 steps when I saw the same car again. This time, it was moving slightly faster, but still way below the speed limit. It passed me again, this time coming from behind. Once again, I didn't look over, but I was starting to feel uneasy. After reaching my goal of 8,000 steps, I turned around and started heading back home. That's when I saw the same car again. But this time, the headlights were off. It was driving slowly behind me, matching my walking speed. I tried to ignore it at first, but the longer it stayed behind me, the more suspicious I became. I finally turned around to look. The car was a bit farther back, but still following me. I couldn't make out who was inside because of the distance and the darkness. When I reached the end of the street, I turned onto the next one, which led back to my street. The car followed me again. I stopped walking and turned around to face it. The car stopped too, just sitting there. For a few moments, it felt like a standoff. I stared at the car and it just stayed still. Then suddenly it started reversing. The driver backed up a short distance, turned around and sped off down the road. I didn't waste any time. I started walking quickly toward my house, expecting the car to appear again at any moment. When I didn't see it for a while, I broke into a jog. I'm not much of a runner, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get home. When I got inside, I locked the doors and tried to calm myself down. I thought about what had just happened, trying to make sense of it. But the story doesn't end there. About an hour later, as I was walking into my living room, I glanced out the window and froze. The same car was parked in my driveway. Its headlights were off, and I couldn't tell if anyone was inside. My heart raced. How did they know where I lived? I stood by the window, watching the car for a while. It didn't move. Finally, I decided to take action. I walked to the front door and flipped on the porch light. About 10 seconds later, I heard the engine start. The car backed out of the driveway, still with the lights off, and sped away. I felt a huge wave of relief, but also fear. What did they want? Why were they following me? I kept checking the windows throughout the night, but thankfully the car didn't come back. Every Saturday, my friends and I get together to watch UFC. We live in the US, so depending on the time zone, this usually means staying up until the early hours of the morning, followed by a painfully tiring walk home afterward. I live on the opposite side of town from my friends, so whenever we watch at one of their houses, I have to walk a good 6 or 7 miles to get home. Unfortunately, I can't afford a car at the moment. This was never really a problem because I don't mind walking as long as I have some music to keep me company. I was also still a naive 17-year-old who thought everyone in my area was friendly and harmless. Needless to say, I was proven wrong. It was September of last year and we were watching UFC. I remember it was John Jones versus Rampage because I lost a substantial amount of money on a bet when Rampage got completely dominated. The event went on until around 3 a.m., at which point we all parted ways and set off home. I had made this walk countless times and considered my chosen route perfectly safe. Looking back now, though, it was probably the worst route I could have taken. I basically followed the main road for about a mile, which led to some back alleys that connected to a 5-mile home stretch consisting of a highway to my right and a wooded park to my left. During the daytime, the park was really inviting. It had swings, slides, and climbing frames, all surrounded by a wall of trees. It was like something straight out of a community park. However, at night, the lack of lighting made it feel like a stereotypical horror movie setting. Anyway, I remember I was listening to Hit the Road Jack by Ray Charles at the time. Not that it's important, but it's a really vivid memory. I was about 2 miles down this road and just coming up to the dreaded playground when I felt a car coming up behind me with the high beams on. It wasn't uncommon for cars to pass me on my walks home. Plenty of cabs frequently drove by, but it was unusual for their lights to be that bright. At first I thought nothing of it, but the lights stayed on me for way longer than they should have. All I kept thinking was, why hasn't this car passed me yet? I took out one of my headphones and heard the engine running really slowly, like when you ease a car out of a driveway. It was at this point that I realized the car was literally right behind me. The driver must have seen me notice because he sped up, so he was now going at the exact same speed as me. Being naive, I thought he was probably just lost or needed directions, so I stopped to see what he wanted. As I stopped, so did he. I took out my other headphone and said something like, "Hey man, what's up?" He didn't say anything. He just stared at me. He looked like he was in his mid-40s, not of American descent. My best guess was that he was Eastern European due to his grayish-white hair, big build, and scruffy appearance. No offense to anyone, of course. It was just my impression. His blank stare really freaked me out, so I just stuck my headphones back in and started walking faster. But this wasn't over. He once again matched my speed, staring at me the whole time, never once looking at the road. As soon as he caught my eye, he started gesturing for me to come over with his hand. Combined with his now grinning face, this really freaked me out. I was genuinely panicking at this point and started weighing my limited options. I could try running home, but that would mean running in a straight line for 4 miles, and he could easily drive alongside me the whole way. So that option was out. I could try acting crazy to scare him off, but I had already shown signs of fear, so that probably would have led to a physical confrontation. I can handle myself in a fair fight, but this guy could have a weapon. That was a definite no. In the end, I had to go for my third and final option, darting into the forest and hiding until he drove off. As much as I didn't want to do it, I jumped over the small ditch between the path and the woods and proceeded to hide in a big jumble of bushes about 20 meters in. At this point, my heart was pounding, and I just sat there, staring at the road, waiting for the car's headlights to disappear. I must have sat there for what felt like an eternity, though it was really just a couple of minutes. But the lights didn't go away. All I could think was, please just drive away. After several more minutes of the lights staying in place, I realized I had to plan another way of getting home, or at least getting away. I figured the only way was to make the rest of the trip through the forest, but I couldn't move. I was genuinely paralyzed with fear. It took me a minute to compose myself, and then I gradually started shuffling forward. I didn't care how long it took, I just had to get home. I edged forward gradually and eventually reached the clearing where the park was. I didn't want to be out in the open, so I was trying to think of the best way around the park when I noticed a dark silhouette sitting on the swing, back turned to me. It could only be him. He must have gotten out of his car to look for me and was just sitting there, waiting. Tears were streaming down my face because I was sure that's what it was. Once again, I found myself paralyzed with fear. He hadn't seen me, and I don't think he heard me, but I felt sick. He just sat there, rocking back and forth. I took a deep breath and then sprinted as fast as I could back through the forest, retracing my steps to the edge of the road where the home stretch had started. I say sprinted, but it felt like one of those dreams where your legs don't work properly and just wobble uncontrollably. From there, I ran all the way back to my friend's house. I barely remember that journey. It felt like 1 second I was in the forest, and the next, I was banging on his door, shaking uncontrollably. He let me in, and his parents called the police, who arrived about an hour later. I had to go to the police station to file a report and give a description of the guy. But they never took it further because my description didn't match anyone known to be dangerous in the area. When my parents found out, they insisted that the police investigate, but the officers didn't think anything illegal had actually happened. I get it, I guess, but there's no way to know what his true intentions were. As far as I'm concerned, I was near death that night. I think it goes without saying that I never walked home alone at that time of night ever again. And now, I'm a hell of a lot more paranoid when it comes to strangers. I work as a security officer for a company in Nevada. We collaborate with the local sheriff's department to ensure the safety of the areas we patrol. My role as a patrol officer is somewhat similar to that of a police officer. Unlike traditional security guards who simply observe and report, we're trained to respond to a wide variety of situations, from dealing with trespassers and burglaries to handling domestic disputes. I've had to chase people on foot and even in vehicles a few times. It's just part of the job. Now that you have a sense of what I do, let me share an experience I'll never forget. I typically work the late shift, but due to staffing shortages, I had to switch to the day shift for a while. I remember driving around the city in my patrol car, listening to our radio for any calls. One night, a burglary alarm came through for my district. It was on the outskirts of town, near the desert. It must have been around 1 a.m. when I got the call to check it out. As I approached the property, I turned onto the road leading to it and went dark, meaning I turned off all my car lights. The site was an old warehouse where they used to process and pack onions. The building had been abandoned for some time, and our company had been hired to keep an eye on it. I had done my checks there plenty of times before, and nothing unusual had ever happened until this night. Keep in mind, the property had no working lights, so it was pitch dark inside. I drove around to the back of the building, carefully scanning the area. That's when I noticed a door was open. I radioed in. Lincoln 1 to dispatch. I found an open door on the west side of the warehouse. Can you send another unit to assist? While waiting, I stood outside my car, enjoying a rare drizzle in the desert. The wind was pretty strong that night too. After about 5 minutes, my partner showed up. He's not just my colleague, but a good friend outside of work. We grabbed our flashlights and headed inside. The first thing that hit us when we walked in was the overwhelming smell of onions. It was so strong it felt like you could taste it in the air. The warehouse was massive, dark, and empty, except for that smell, which was everywhere. We started searching the area when things began to get unsettling. We could hear the light rain tapping on the metal roof and the wind whistling through cracks in the building. Then we heard it. Footsteps on the roof. I looked at my partner and said, "These warehouses don't have roof access. How is someone up there?" He shrugged and replied, "I have no idea." I radioed in again. Lincoln 1 to dispatch. "We're hearing footsteps on the roof. We're investigating and will update shortly." Dispatch confirmed, and we continued searching the warehouse. After combing through the entire building, we went outside to inspect the perimeter. Sure enough, there was no way anyone could have gotten onto the roof. Not in that weather, and not without some kind of equipment. We chalked it up to the wind and called it a code 4, meaning all clear. But as we were walking back through the warehouse to get to our cars, something happened that I'll never forget. Out of nowhere, we heard whispering, multiple voices, all at once. The whispers were clear, but neither of us could make out what they were saying. My partner and I froze in our tracks and just stared at each other. I could see the unease on his face, which I'm sure mirrored my own. I called in again, code 6, requesting backup. We're conducting a second sweep of the property. We knew what we heard wasn't normal, but we had to be thorough and make sure no one was still inside. That's when things escalated. Doors around the warehouse started slamming shut, one after another. My partner and I didn't say a word. We just turned and walked straight out of the building. Once we were outside, I radioed in a final code 4 and told my partner, let's just say it was the wind. That was the last time I ever went to that warehouse before I got promoted to corporal and switched to day shifts. To this day, I still don't believe in most ghost stories, but I can tell you one thing for sure. Whatever happened that night, it wasn't just the wind. I used to live in a small rural town in Texas and worked at a local Domino's. To get to my house, I had to walk past a stretch of woods. I've been working at Domino's since I was 17, and now I'm 19. Walking past those woods was always routine. Nothing unusual ever happened to me. But today was different. My shift at Domino's ended at 7:30 p.m., which was later than my usual time. As I headed home, I could see the woods coming up about a mile ahead. A narrow road with trees lining both sides. By this time it was getting dark, and there were barely any cars or people around. The little light left from the day only made the scene feel more unsettling. As I walked, I thought I heard something coming from the trees. I stopped to look but didn't see anything. Shrugging it off, I kept walking. Then, out of nowhere, a rock landed right in front of me. Alarmed, I turned to face the woods and saw someone waving at me. It was too dark to make out any details about them. I called out, "Do you need something?" The person responded in a loud whisper, "Come over here. I want to show you something." I replied, "Sorry, I need to get home. I can't be late." But he insisted, "Oh, don't worry, it'll only take a second. I really need your help with something." I hesitated, but eventually gave in, saying, "Okay, I'll help, but I only have a minute." He replied, "A minute is all I need." Taking a deep breath, I stepped closer to him. He told me he had found a man-made hole dug in the ground and wanted to see what was inside. He added that he didn't have a light. I offered to shine my phone flashlight down the hole. That was the biggest mistake of my life. I walked over to the hole with the man standing behind me. Just as I was about to shine the light, he shoved me from behind. I fell about 20 feet and landed on something soft. Dazed, I stood up and started yelling and cursing at him. But when I looked up, he was gone. Then I realized I had landed on something. I could feel it beneath me, and dread washed over me as I reached for my phone to shine the flashlight. When the light hit the ground, my stomach dropped. I was standing on a body, a young woman probably around my age, covered in deep cuts. She was dead. I froze, staring at her lifeless form, unable to process what I was seeing. I stayed down there for at least 30 minutes before finally mustering the strength to climb out. When I got home, I didn't tell anyone about what I had seen. To this day, it haunts me. About a year ago, I spent a decent amount of time working in a different city from where I live. One particularly cold evening, the Airbnb I had booked was quite far from my workplace. I didn't have a car, and to make matters worse, I hadn't packed a warm coat. Desperate for something to keep me warm during my walk back, I ducked into a nearby Walmart to grab something temporary, planning to return it the next morning. The best option I could find was an oversized double XL fuzzy bathrobe. It wasn't exactly what I wanted, but it was warm and I figured it would do the job. My walk back took me through a beautiful botanical garden that ran alongside a waterway. By this time, it was nearing midnight, and I was about halfway through my journey. Normally, I'm very aware of my surroundings, especially at night, but that evening, I had let my guard down. Part of it was because of the ridiculous bathrobe. I felt like I was wrapped in a cozy, fuzzy suit of armor. Suddenly, I felt uneasy, like something was off, but I couldn't quite figure out why. Then I heard it. Soft murmurs. My first thought was that it was two men having a hushed conversation nearby. Feeling exposed, I rounded a corner and ducked into a cluster of trees, holding my breath and straining to make sense of what I was hearing. I caught the sound of light footsteps and the low hum of voices. As the two men got closer to where I was hiding, panic set in. I cursed myself for not being more careful. Nobody else was around at that hour, so screaming wouldn't help. Being a petite woman, the whole situation felt like a waking nightmare. Then I heard one of them say, "She's around here somewhere." My stomach dropped. I felt physically sick, but just as my panic peaked, one of the men let out a low whistle, followed by the jingle of a collar. Moments later, a dog came sprinting past my hiding spot, tail wagging furiously. Then I heard one of them say, "Good girl," followed by the kind of affectionate cooing people reserve for their pets. Relief washed over me. They weren't looking for me. They were looking for their dog. As I adjusted the bathrobe to cover my head from the cold, I stepped out from the trees. What I didn't realize was how ridiculous I looked. The oversized bathrobe's arms had ended up sticking straight out on top of my head, making me look like some bizarre, fuzzy creature. I also didn't realize that the men had slowed their pace and were only a few feet ahead of me on the path. The moment I emerged from the trees, one of them screamed in terror and the other let out a loud curse. They both bolted across the bridge over the waterway, the dog barking frantically as it chased after them. Later that night, I snapped a picture of myself in the mirror while still wearing that bathrobe. Every time I look at it, I can't help but laugh at the thought of how terrifying I must have looked to those poor guys.